Body condition score is determined by visual inspection of the cow and by the muscle and fat covering of the palpated regions. Begin body condition scoring by visually examining the cow from behind. Peer down both sides of the cow and look over the top line. Then begin palpating the cow, starting with the rearmost region. Palpate the pin bone and tailhead area. Run your hand along the thurl. Palpate the hook bone, the short ribs, and the overhanging shelf. Visually inspecting the flesh covering the backbone is useful for determining a cow's body condition score. A backbone with a sawtoothed appearance is a sign of minimal energy stores. On the other hand, when the vertebrae are indistinguishable from one another, the cow has sufficient or excess energy stores. The pin bones are the protruding bones lateral to the tailhead. By feeling the amount of muscle covering the pin bone and pinching the skin covering the pin bone, you can estimate the general flesh and fat covering of the cow. The tailhead region is where the tail joins the pelvis and includes the area shown here. Determining the amount of muscle and fat covering in this area can help you estimate the cow's energy stores. The thurl is the area between the pin bone and the hook bone. By running your hand between these bones, you can determine the concavity of the thurl. Cows with concave thurls have lower energy reserves than do cows with flat or convex thurls. The hook bones are the bones seen here lateral to the spine. Like the pin bones, by feeling the amount of flesh covering the hook bone and gently pinching the skin covering the hook bone, you can estimate the energy reserves of the cow. Cows with very angular and prominent hook bones have lower energy reserves than cows with smooth, rounded hook bones. The short ribs are the transverse processes of the vertebrae and are located between the hook bone and the true ribs. Palpating the short ribs, as shown here, and estimating the extent of the overhanging shelf effect, which is obvious on this cow, can help you determine a cow's body condition score. The ischial ligament is located between the pin bone and the tail head, as seen here. This ligament is the sacroiliac junction and is located between the hook bone and backbone. The overall appearance of this cow is skin and bones. The contours of her pelvic and backbones are sharp and prominent. You can't see any fat padding. There is a deep cavity around the tailhead. The bone structures are extremely sharp. We are looking over the top line of the cow. The hook bones and the individual processes of the backbone look sharp and distinct. It's a sawtoothed appearance. Notice the deep depressions between the short ribs and the spine. In the side view, the transverse processes, or short ribs, are very prominent. There is a sharp edge on the transverse processes, and the overhanging shelf effect is pronounced. The pin bones are sharp with absolutely no flesh covering. Notice that only skin can be pinched. You see a deep cavity around her tailhead. Notice that the bone structures are extremely sharp. The ligaments are quite prominent. When you run your hand from the pin bone to the hook bone, you feel a deep depression. There is a clear concavity and no flesh covering. The ligament that connects the hook bone and backbone is sharp. The hook bones are prominent, with no fat padding. The individual processes are distinct. The backbone has a sawtoothed appearance. You can feel a depression between the short ribs and the spine. Notice how pronounced the overhanging shelf effect is. This cow is underconditioned. The bones of her pelvis, pin bone, and hook bone are obvious. The individual vertebrae are visible and distinct. This cow's tailhead is bony with almost no flesh covering. Her backbone is jagged and her spinal processes are obvious. The pin bone and hook bone are sharp. There is an obvious lack of flesh covering compared with the BCS 3.0 cow. This cow's pin bones have a bit more flesh covering and are more rounded than the BCS 2.0 cow. Compared to the BCS 2.0 cow, this cow's tailhead is less concave and the bones are not as sharp. There is still very little flesh covering, however. The ischial ligament is very prominent. The thurl itself is quite concave. The sacroiliac junction is not as pronounced as that of the BCS 2.0 cow. The hook bone still has almost no flesh covering and very little skin can be pinched. The short ribs require only light palpation to be felt. The overhanging shelf effect of this cow is quite severe. Overall, this cow has fairly rounded contours. Her pelvic bone and backbone appear smooth. There is a bit of fat cover around the tailhead area, but certainly no major depressions on either side of the tail. When looking over the backbone of the cow, it's difficult to see individual vertebrae or spinous processes. They are fairly smooth, but there is still some slope from the spine down to the shelf of the short ribs. In the side view, the transverse processes look fairly rounded, but there is still an edge visible. The overhanging shelf effect is moderate. The pin bones are round instead of angular. This cow has a little bit of padding over the bones, approximately 1 centimeter or so. You can see that the tailhead blends fairly smoothly into the pins. When you slide your hand beside the tail, it's fairly soft. There are no major depressions and no signs of extreme fat deposition. The ischial ligament is not too prominent and feels quite soft. There is some concavity across the side of the pelvis. The hook bones can be easily seen and they look reasonably rounded. The sacroiliac junction is quite smooth and can be easily felt. You can differentiate the individual processes of the short ribs, but they are well padded and rounded. The contour of the cow below the short ribs is also rounded and smooth. Overall, this cow is mildly over-conditioned. It is difficult to make out her pelvis. The hook bone and backbone are well rounded. Peering over the top line of the cow, the individual vertebrae are not distinguishable, and there is evidence of fat deposition. The hook bone, pin bone, and short ribs of this cow are fairly well padded. Notice that the spine appears flat. The pin bone is now well padded compared to the BCS 3.0 cow. Fat deposition is obvious when palpated. The tail head has lost all angularity and is beginning to fill in with fat. The ligament can be felt only with firm palpation. This cow's thurl is mildly concave. The sacroiliac junction is level with the short ribs. The hook bone is heavily padded with fat and can be pinched easily. The short ribs are not visible, but can be felt with firm palpation. The short ribs are rounded and the overhanging shelf effect is minimal. Overall, this cow is overconditioned or obese. Her pelvic bones and backbone cannot be distinguished visually. The area around the tail head is smooth. You can see clear evidence of fat deposition. The back looks solid, like a tabletop, and individual vertebrae or spinous processes are not visible. In the side view, the transverse processes, or short ribs, cannot be seen as individual bones and are distinguishable only by firm palpation. The shelf formed by the short ribs is well rounded. The pin bones on the 4.0 cow are rounded, and there is also obvious fat padding. The tailhead area here appears smooth and rounded. You can see folds of fat. Sometimes the tailhead area appears to be buried in fat. The span between the pin bones and hook bones has almost no concavity. The thurl is filled in with fat. The hook bones are rounded and have an obvious fat padding. They almost look like a ball. The short ribs cannot be seen and can only be felt with firm pressure. The shelf formed by the short ribs is well rounded.